Sorry?
Just face like this, right?
No.
Because I know the settings.
This one.
Okay.
GIGAR.
You're going to mention this, right? Like these things. Are you going to mention?
You can mention that.
Can you mention?
Yeah. That's me.
So let's get started. Thank you for patiently waiting and actually showing up early, or showing up on time, I should say. So we should get started. I know a few people are still apparently straggling their way in. I thought we should wait, but it's already an hour since we supposed to be starting. That said, it's so thrilled to introduce Murali Shanmugavelan. I think it's from what I know of Murali, and it's a very brief period of my knowing him. He's a maverick. I think it's fair to say he also likes to be a nomad. Murali grew up in an urban slum in Madurai. This is in South India. I think what he's going to present today in some ways completes the full circle of his journey so far. I'm going to let him elaborate on that. He's passionate about anti-caste movements, drawn to Periyar's self-respect movement, and later to Ambedkar's philosophy of humanism that can only be bounded by love and humanism. The Periyar in the early days shaped Murali's his beliefs, and I think he was also very fascinated by the influence of media and communication that was particularly related to social movements that was happening. I first found out about Murali through a common friend who had recommended him to be a program chair, a program committee member, and I had a phone conversation with him, and it was very immediately clear that it is to having somebody talk about caste and have done work with caste in a way with technology is something that we've not seen in the ICTD circle. So I immediately jumped on this opportunity to kind of have him and have we all hear him. Murali has 20 years of experience working on research, policy, and development projects in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia that seek to leverage media such as the internet and mobile phones to address social problems. He's worked with government actors in these regions, such as the Ministry of Agriculture, Irrigation, Livestock in Afghanistan, and the Access to Information Project in Bangladesh. In reaction to the time-bound nature of ICT and development projects, Murali began his PhD at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, using ethnographic methods to study the communicative practices of a Dalit caste group in Tamil Nadu, known as Arundhatiyars. His thesis explores how the hierarchical nature of caste communication networks shapes and is shaped by modern digital networks. I hope he explains that in his presentation. There was a lot of loaded sentence there. Shanmugavelan is also the director of Maple Consulting Services, a consulting firm that works with governments, NGOs, and private institutions in the United Kingdom and internationally to address social and economic challenges through media-related policies and practices. An interesting anecdote that he wanted me to share. In one village called Embalam in Pondicherry, the telecenter or the kiosk was housed in a temple that did not traditionally allow Dalits and menstruated women in it. While our telecenters broke the barriers. So this was apparently reported by Celia Duggar in the New York Times, and Murali, who was being part of the project, felt amazing that this was happening in where he grew up. So technology can break social barriers, and of course he's going to elaborate on and what that means and how that plays out in his own work. So with that, let me welcome Murali.
Good morning. Once again, thanks for coming, especially the last day. I know it's and so early. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. Just to set the context before I start my presentation, just follow up on what Rajesh said. My presentation can be done in less than 2 minutes, to be honest. It's basically, I'm just making one simple point, which is why caste, a social hierarchical category and a relationship hampered by social barriers and disparities, why that should be recognized as a communication category and why that has been ignored in ICT for the ICTD community so far. I think for those who are actually on the right side of politics, this doesn't need any further explanation. Perhaps this might require a cup of tea conversation saying that, yes, that is correct. That is correct. Sorry, we haven't addressed it so far. So let's do it. And that's one way of ending this keynote address. And then we can all move to foyer. But the task is a bit larger than that. That's what I intend to do. One is, I'd like to make a dispassionate argument, apart from my political positions, that caste has elements that are inherently communicative in nature. So instead of actually making a passionate political argument, what I'm going to do now, just unpack for logical purposes that this actually needs to be done, whether you like it or not. Because if you're interested in media, communication, networks related that sort of discipline, you cannot ignore caste, like the way you cannot ignore gender or race. So that's what I'm trying to do now. Forgive me if I'm speaking a little bit of a jargon, which I will, here and there, but stay with me because I will pepper them with lots of examples and case studies and so on and so forth. I don't want to assume that everyone knows caste, so I think it's a good way of introducing that. What I think caste for the purpose of this particular presentation, because it's something very hard to define. People have continuously defined caste, and if you go to an anthropologist, they have a particular way of defining. If you speak to a political economist or political sociologist, I mean, if you speak to Dipankar Gupta, he'll have a completely different take on caste compared to someone else like Professor David Moss, who's an anthropologist. So it's just lots out there. But I don't want to get into that discussion because that will take us somewhere else. It is worth actually giving a set of, a dispassionate outline, what I mean by caste for the purpose of this conversation. Parts of it I'm going to read from the prepared speech, but bear with me. So caste is the English equivalent of jati, and it's there is a popular notion associated with caste, which is, it's rooted in Hindu divine scriptures, and it has its source from the Hindu tradition and so on and so forth. But let's park that for a moment, because that's, I'm not saying therefore it doesn't exist, but let's park that for a moment. What I'm actually interested in is that caste has certain characteristics, and that characteristics extend beyond Hindu religion. So, for example, caste is oppressive. It is defined by endogamy, and it is largely sustained on a marriage within kinship. But more specifically, these practices exist beyond Hindu religion. So, in caste-affected societies, for example, not just in India, but also in Sri Lanka, Nepal, Pakistan. So this is not just a conversation about India. And in South Asian societies, if you look at it, these characteristics exist in all these societies. So for the purpose of this conversation, I don't want to actually bring caste into one particular religion, but the characteristics of caste does exist in many societies. In fact, it does exist in the UK, where I live at the moment. In fact, the government of Britain tried to introduce a consultation to end caste-based discrimination in that country, which kind of met with some failure. But the government of Britain, the Parliament, clearly said caste does exist in the UK. So it's not just a phenomenon exclusive to this part of the world. Like Ambedkar said, wherever Indians go, they take caste with them. So the diasporic community is also full of caste. And there is this element of, traditionally there is this element of impure, pollution, untouchability. And these are very real, but these are also changing. But where I want you to focus on, let us not actually get very much, wound up by these atrocities, which are real. But caste untouchability, the untouchability aspects of caste, it has got ups and downs. If you look at, especially in the modern era, as of today, in contemporary caste-affected societies, we may not find untouchability as obvious as it was once. So those sort of overt transactions may appear to have been prescribed, but discrimination does exist. And that is particularly important for this particular conversation, because we will be looking at how discrimination and digital networks actually do that interplay. So modernity sort of recodifies caste, and it is built into the contemporary social technical systems, which I shall explain. And it's worth actually looking at one of the philosopher and social reformist of Dalit movement, or leaders of anti-caste movement, Ambedkar, who famously said, he described caste as an enclosed class. And these are very important, which I will revisit in a moment. He said caste is an enclosed class, and it prevents social and employment mobility. So whenever we talk about development, inclusion, and empowerment, that sort of emancipatory categories, it's worth noting that we have a communication category that inherently prevents social and employment mobility. So you have a whole range of emancipatory development projects going on, and you operate in a particular environment which is absolutely antithetical to what you set out to do. So that's sort of a challenging environment. That's something that we ICTD practitioners should be aware of. And more importantly, one of the very amazing hypothesis of Ambedkar about caste system is not merely a division of labor. It is also division of laborers. And this is particularly very keen. I really invite you to pay attention to these sort of nuanced expressions, because this will have a lot when I start talking about examples and case studies. So caste system therefore tends to stigmatize and undervalue jobs generally done by Dalits. So it's not just about actually you have one job this way, the other job treated that way. No, it's basically the caste system puts, however important is a particular job, it is forever to be graded as low. So that's sort of a prefix notion that comes with caste system. That's particular. So that's actually, if you look at Marxian analysis, division of labor, he talks about working class and ruling class. No, but Ambedkar's analysis is that amongst even working class, you have division of laborers. Therefore, some people's work will never be regarded as equal as others, because they have belonged to certain caste and they belong to certain occupations. So, the reason I'm inviting you to think about this, so we are operating in caste-affected societies. We are operating in this particular environment to bring about inclusion and empowerment and amplifying voices and so on. So therefore, it's a very difficult job. Therefore, I invite researchers and practitioners to pay attention to this particular category, which is very, very difficult and challenging to engage with. But caste is not all about, I've given a very the oppressed side of it, but caste also can afford social privileges, especially to those who belong to upper caste and upper end of hierarchy and power. For example, the people who are at the upper end, they can actually act together, they can join together, stay together. So caste is also acts as an opportunity holding networks. So this is again an important one. When you look at caste-affected societies and you think, we are doing ICTD projects and it's all about networks, we are putting structural networks in place and everyone is part of it. No, it's not going to happen that easily, because you already have a caste network and it has a very different way of actually engaging with the rest of the other networks. So caste can also offer social privileges, as I said. And one set of people can have opportunities and privilege and arising out of certain kind of networks. The other people can have humiliation, exclusion, separation, forced subordination, degradation in everyday life. And how this ICTD sort of networks are going to address this sort of a deeply entrenched social disparity, something that I'd like to put forward to you. To think of a white male privileged network. That's how I would, similar to that, you have an upper caste network. So it's a boys club, upper caste network, just like that. And another thing is that caste is also increasingly being romanticized. especially in a globalized, multicultural societies. I mean, every time I see London festival, any multicultural festival in London, and whenever they talk about South Asian festival or Indian festival, the markers are always about upper caste network markers. It's never about democratized. It's never looking at a subaltern markers. I mean, in the UK, I don't know if those of you know that if you're familiar with the caste system in the UK. In Wolverhampton and in Bradford, you have a very massive presence of low caste Dalit people in Britain. And they are never represented as sort of a part of a multicultural bandwagon. It's always one set of people. So it's interesting, but the reason I'm bringing out this is that caste is also recodified. Again, I'm using these terms, which are kind of a parallel to concepts that we use in digital networks and so on. Caste is constantly recodified in cultural terms as sort of cultural identity and diversity. It's also perceived to be a community. And that's a very dangerous way of manipulating a category that is deeply entrenched in social hierarchy and manipulate that term into a community. So caste is also sort of going through very interesting manipulative definitions, especially in modern times, which are not very helpful to people who are oppressed by that system. The second thing is that I mentioned that caste elements are extremely communicative. I think this is very important because I think one of the reasons why we should pay attention to caste, I mean, caste should be paid attention anyway because it's a very anti-development term, but especially for ICTD communities, the features of caste are very much in tune with how, any other communication networks. Let me first actually talk about, in my talk I keep on repeating saying that caste is a communication category, the word category. Let me emphasize on what I mean by that word category. So the category is basically, if you look at anthropology or sociology, the classifications of systems, and they are used in all sorts of human cultures. These systems usually do not have explicit formal structures. For example, in the sense that it may not follow a written form, such as retrieval of information from manual or computerized system. But these systems actually are coded, ingrained in everyday practices. And these systems are expressed through interactions. And these systems are expressed through everyday nuances and practices. That's what I mean by categories. And I find that caste is actually, caste as a category, it's got, if you look at, for example, it's some of the features like exclusion, inclusion, touch, untouch. All these are speak or non-speak and ostracized spatially, geographically. And all these are communication elements. So the features of caste are nothing but elements of communication. That's very important for us to remember. And what's the relationship between caste and communication? As I said, caste has always lived through communicative elements for its power to manifest through interactions and expressions. And caste, especially in caste-affected societies, is a pervasive glue, and that's, again, it's a pervasive glue, or the rupture, depending on one's caste rank and rank-based perspective, without which social interaction is incomplete. So, when you're talking about digital networks and other sort of nodes, it's important to understand you have a very, very deeply entrenched networks, which I'll come to that in a minute, that is called caste. So caste is not something like a social evil, but it is a communication network in many ways, and it operates in a very, very crucial level. And it's not actually sitting outside of communication network. It can actually influence your communication network. One of my oft-repeated quotes is that caste remains caste is, caste is constitutive of and constituted by social communication. Therefore, whatever we do, whatever projects we do, you cannot escape from that. So it's important to pay attention to that, when you're rolling out a certain kind of networks or projects, ICTD projects, what does that mean? How is this caste as a network going to actually respond to this particular intervention? Because it's much more powerful. It's been there for quite some time. And this is where, I'd like to invite you to think about, is caste a very unique thing to be recognized as a communication category? Not necessarily. There have been other cases, other categories are equally recognized as communication categories. Therefore, I'm not proposing anything radical or new. I'm only following some of the historical trajectory in this sense. And the one important aspect is Stuart Hall's race, the way the Stuart Hall theorized race as a culture and communication category. And by doing that, Hall comes up with this amazing idea of what he calls articulation, how race is being articulated in cultural studies. Let me just unpack what I mean by that. Typically articulation in the day-to-day time, life denotes utterances of speech. But the way that Hall or Laclave, the way that they mean, it's just not actually utterances, not just utterances, but refers to the relationship between communicative elements, and together with various elements, they form a moment, and that moment actually resulting in some sort of a discourse. So, how do we, for example, I'll give you an example of this. How does this work in caste scenario? Some of you might have heard this very tragic news a few years ago in Mumbai. There was a guy, there was a bunch of Dalit youths who were sitting in a wine bar and drinking beer or whatever, and next to them was clearly non-Dalit person having a drink, and this person's, the Dalit person's mobile phone suddenly started to ring. And the ringtone was nothing but, it was a sort of an emancipatory song sung by one of the Dalit movement singer. And it basically, the song, I can't remember exactly what it was. It was all about emancipatory thing. It was praising Ambedkar, the leader of Dalit movement. So the guy next to, so it was just a mobile phone ringing, and there had no connection whatsoever between this group and the other group. So the other group, the upper caste guy, and he came to the Dalit group people and said, put the phone off, turn it down. I don't want to hear this ringtone. And they said they didn't understand what was going on. Before anything, just in a minute or so, this boy's, the boy whose phone was ringing, he was dragged out of the wine bar, and he was right there, stabbed and killed immediately. Now, this is a very interesting, tragic scenario, but I just put that aside just for a second. What I invite you to do, so how does this actually work? How does this articulation here actually happen to invoke such an amount of hatred on someone with no connection, with no social relationship whatsoever? It's just actually about just this forming of elements. Phone, ringtone, and he hears the music, and nothing, he has no idea who these people are, but just by listening to it, immediately the scene was set. The killer scene was set. And this is what I call is kind of elements, communicative elements forming together and then resulting in a discourse which might actually be quite hateful, or it can actually even result in death of a person. It's just an auto-articulation. One doesn't even have to necessarily say anything. So in caste-affected societies, articulation can be auto-articulation, and it can also be beyond text, speech, language. It doesn't have to be always, sometimes it doesn't even have to be a mobile phone. It just, your behavior could also, set the articulation. So the reason I'm talking about articulation so much, because we are particularly, when you talk about digital networks and so on, we are very concerned with voices. And social inclusion, empowering people through voices, and so on and so forth. But when you look at through caste prism, Articulation is much more nuanced and refined, and it's more actually powerful than voices. Sometimes you can even say things, but you may not mean it. But articulation is actually, it's located in it's a plea for politics and power. And articulation, I find it's much more helpful in understanding. So for example, if in a project, if I'm asked to say, oh, how many voices have you actually, how many people have you amplified, or how many people have you included? To me, what matters most is that articulation is most important. Here's another example. In a telecenter which I was part of several years ago that Rajesh mentioned, the donors came and they wanted to actually evaluate, the empowerment of so-called marginalized communities. So we were very happily, desperately trying to please this donor agency. And they said, oh, that's all good, but there are very little people still getting benefits from these centers. You should actually improve the number of beneficiaries, so that for that way, inclusion can be measured more positively, right? But then there was a very interesting point that one of my colleagues mentioned, and I agree with him. He said, we don't know whether more people will be getting benefits from these telecenters or not, because probably this is the maximum optimal we can do. But what we could tell you is that there's a Dalit colony not far from here, and no one actually came from there to this center for a very long time. But the last 2 weeks or so, the two women, they at least wanted to come and check it out. What's going on here? I mean, they don't get anything much. It's not much happening. I don't think they provide things that they actually want. But there is the social process. The woman actually thinks, oh, there's something happening. I can come, I can check it out, and then I can find out what's going on. It is that social process I call articulation. That's more, yes?
I'm really trying to understand what you're trying to make. I'm struggling alongside this. When you use the term articulation, do you mean an action, or is articulation a social process that I should be thinking about? Sorry. Do you mean, when you refer to the articulation of these women, are you saying, here is an articulation that is happening because these women are coming to the telecenter, and that's an interesting communicative act? Should I be sort of thinking about speech acts or something like that? Is that where I should be thinking? Or should I be thinking about articulation, race as articulation in terms of, I think about an articulated lorry and a divide within society? I don't understand what I'm...
The first one, the act.
Great, I really understand what you're talking about now, thanks.
Okay. So it's a combination of, as I said, articulation can be beyond text, message, language, and it's a combination of many things, and it's about act. Again, the very famous subaltern question, Spivak's question, can the subaltern speak? And the articulated response would be, can the power holders listen? Or do they have enabling environment so that the most marginalized can actually act, articulate? That's the kind of when we're talking about. And going back to the one that I mentioned in the previous, it's a while ago, caste networks and communication networks. And this again is a very crucial thing, because caste is also viewed comparably, especially by anthropologists and sociologists. Caste is also viewed comparably as a kind of a networks process, especially in the field of economy, in anthropology, ethnographic studies. Although it's rarely featured in formal network analysis that link micro interactions to structural outcomes at meso and macro level. The point here is that a strictly anti-categorical structural network, basically you're putting a communication network in place, structural network, right? that approach in which nodes are only a function of interactions. Oh, I've got the telecenters here, so therefore people will be able to have access to information, therefore the inclusion is possible. That sort of notion. That sort of approach ignores the importance of circulating cultural and political discourses of caste. So you have a digital network or communication network, or analog, whatever communication networks. But then you do have this caste as again, which has all elements of communicative elements, and it's also having its own network. Therefore, they kind of constantly at interplay. And it's very important to notice that communication network is not alone and cannot escape caste network in caste-affected societies. So whatever you do in any projects in caste-affected societies, it's worth asking ourselves, how does the caste network is going to actually interplay with our networks? Because it's not about one thing or the other, it's the interplay, depending on how you roll it out. Let me share a case study here. It's a very interesting one. It's about how mobile phone networks actually interplay with caste network. In a field work where I did for my PhD, this particular community was actually, their forced occupation was manual scavenging. So I became friends with this one particular chap, and I told him one day, let's actually go to a nearby town, because there was an NGO that I was attached to. And that NGO said, oh, bring this gentleman, he's very articulate, he can talk very well. So we might actually like to engage with him so that we can recruit him as a sort of our representative in a Dalit colony, so that he can actually act as a sort of intermediary between us and the local community. Then I asked him, he said, that's fine, we can go. Then I told him that then you should inform your employer, because he was employed locally in a brick making masonry, which is owned by upper caste group just outside the colony. And he said to me, no, I don't want to inform him, because there is no, it's not like an office job. If you call him and inform him, then he'll think that, oh, you're such a big man, you're calling me to say that you're taking a day off, then he won't give me a job. There's no guarantee that I get a job next day, so don't worry, I'll deal it with myself. Fine, I said, that's good. So the next day I went to pick him up, and then he hadn't informed his boss, employer, and I warned him, I think it's a really bad idea not to tell him, so let's actually tell him one way or the other. Then he told me, okay, here's my phone, why don't you text him? And he asked me to text his employer in Tamil, saying that, can't come to work today, will come tomorrow, sorry about it, thank you. That's it. And I wrote it in Tamil. He couldn't write Tamil text. Text was sent. The moment the text was sent, immediately the employer called him back. And the employer was really pissed off. And the reason for his anger was that he said, you never send me a text. Just this is the last time you're sending me a text. To cut the long story short, what actually happened was the employer felt extremely, he felt disrespected. Because normally, the kind of a transaction that happens is that this guy would go, and then, there's a lot of ritual in seeking this leave of absence. And there's a sort of a posturing, and so there's this honorification. The mobile network completely and radically disrupted this entire process. It de-ritualized the whole process. The mobile phone network, what it said to him, hey, sorry, can't come, we'll come tomorrow, bye-bye. And then he felt, oh my God, what is he doing? And then the employer took all measures to reclaim that network. So the point I'm trying to say is not whether mobile phone networks is superior or caste networks is superior or not. The constant interplay, and they're trying to get the power back. Whenever the mobile phone disrupts, the caste network becomes acutely aware that, oh, this is not right. I'm going to reclaim that power. And because the caste network is much more deeply entrenched, and there's a lot of other dependency factor going on, communication network takes a backseat. or digital networks take, in this case, mobile networks take a backseat. So this is kind of if mobile networks are kind of ubiquitous in our field of inquiry, then caste networks are omnipresent. It's there. It's like in air. It's just waiting for it to happen. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's, and also not just that, how the mobile phone, we've read lots of ethnography on how mobile phones are used by certain communities in certain contexts. The other thing that I found absolutely amazing was they would, for example, if I'm traveling with a Dalit person, or my research subject, I would get a call from upper caste person, and I would be in the bus. And if I didn't pick up the phone call, I know the name, I say, okay, let me not talk to him, I put the phone back. Then 3 minutes after, another call would come with some other phone the number I had no idea of. It was always constantly counter-checking which number I'm actually prioritizing or not. And depending on that, it's not actually I'm answering phone, it's more about which network a caste network I'm actually responding to. And I'll be framed. So it's a sort of it's very interesting how during my fieldwork, how mobile phone as a network had this constant interplay with caste network all the time. And it was amazing to see, and it just opened my eyes. It's just the caste network is so powerful. And every time mobile network tried to disrupt the caste network come back at it and they say, we're going to set it all right. And I was told very specifically after that incident by that upper caste employer not to help anyone sending text. He said, sending text is disrespectful. No, we don't do that, and you're not helping anyone. That's what I was told. While I've given you some sort of a flavor about how caste network and caste as a communication category, there's sort of a challenging side. But it's also very interesting to see how some of the public intellectuals from caste-affected societies actually romanticize some of the contribution by caste networks into the digital network. I just want to give you just 2 examples. The first one is actually, you'll be very surprised to see, from Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen, he actually made a very radical presentation in 2007 in Delhi, and the presentation was to NASCOM, National Software Association. He said, let me quote, in the speech to Trade Association of the Indian Information Technology and Business Process Outsourcing Industry in 2007, Amartya Sen explained that India's IT success for its historical respect for skills. He actually used the word, caste has lots of nasty habits, but caste also has a very historical distinctive skills of specialization. What he was referring to was caste-based occupation resulted in certain sense of specialization of skills, and that was one of the reasons behind India's success in IT industry. That's what he said. And it received a huge criticism from Dalit quarters and anti-caste quarters, but made no mention whatsoever in the ICTD community. And the reason I'm saying is that while it is very difficult for a person like me to make the case why caste should be recognized as a communication category, at the same time there is another set of people who easily make casteist remarks that perpetuate caste-related hierarchy, which actually feeds into ICTD discourses. So that's a very interesting analysis. And similarly, there's a magazine called The Prospect coming from England. And Prospect ran a very interesting piece around the same time. And they said one of the reasons for India's success for IT industry is because Indian priestly class mastered the chanting Vedic scriptures without a flaw, and that enabled them to write codes much better. They're much better placed to write flawless codes because of their Vedic training. So imagine that the kind of how sort of a narration on one side is actually adding to how romanticizing caste network. The other side is a complete deafening silence, and someone like me have to make a case for it. So that's a kind of an interesting way of how we approach this issue, right? Yeah, that's the one. And having said this, now I'd like to actually invite you to look at a few concepts. Like if you actually view the ICTD or ICTs, or digital networks, from the caste prism, how are some of the concepts, how would they look like? How would they be different? Because I kind of established so far why caste is important, why caste features are actually filled with communicative elements, and how it's a category, and why it should be looked at in articulation beyond voices and act. But by doing so, let's look at how some of the concepts would look like if we happen to view them by using caste lens. Privacy. Now, privacy is a hot topic in our field, and my view is that the argument for and against privacy, I mean, take in any particular context, especially in caste-affected countries, the arguments are largely borrowed from the West and pushed out by civil society organizations, largely located in metropolis. But then, what does privacy mean to someone who's oppressed by caste structure? That's what I'd like to ask. So how does this actually sit in? The privacy that's as articulated by ICTD communities, as opposed to the privacy issues affected by someone like a Dalit. Here's again an example. I was in the field work, so the Union Government of India's representative, came to this remote village. They set up these machines to roll out this Aadhaar registration. I'm sure everyone knows Aadhaar. I don't have to explain that. And the whole village, ran, and they were so excited to see all these gadgets. It's like really, glim, shiny gadgets. And I was in the colony, and I was talking to my friends, and I told my friends, hey, that there's been a lot of concerns about Aadhaar, and I tried to explain to them, not so much so actually preventing them from being registered, but just to kind of get a sense of what they think about Aadhaar and privacy and so on and so forth. And so then there was a crowd around me, like probably about 10, 20 people, because they took my word seriously. And they said, oh, are you really saying we shouldn't register? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just actually telling you these are some of the concerns raised by people who oppose Aadhaar from this country. And the first question they came to me, who are these people? And then finally, the decision made by the local community, I don't think the community was, hell with them, we will go and we need this to be registered, we need to be registered in the system. The answer, their justification was, we as Arundhadiyar, manual scavengers, have been excluded by the state for a very long time. This perhaps is the first time that state has actually come forward to recognize the existence of our lives. So therefore, I'm not going to miss this opportunity and listen to some Tom from urban, some from metropolis areas. So to heck with them, I'm not going to listen to them. And they have the luxury, they have the affordability to ignore Aadhaar. And here we are, just at the first ladder, the first ladder of the step, beginning to be recognized by the state. I'm not saying this to actually justify Aadhaar at all. I'm just saying that how a concept can be completely looked at very differently when a caste lens is used as a prism. That's what I'm trying to say. So there are, topics like surveillance, for example. I mean, if you look at the debates for and against surveillance, I mean, there's no debate for surveillance, but anyway, a surveillance-related debate. I mean, if you look at the colony, spatial exclusion, and Dalits' lives, they were surveilled for centuries. Their life do not exist without surveillance whatsoever. And their idea of surveillance is completely different from some of our ideas of surveillance. And all I'm trying to say is that these are the communicative elements of caste that one has to pay attention to when we're talking about, when we're rolling out these, when we look at some of these concepts, privacy, surveillance, and so on and so forth. So to the Arundhadiyar community that I was working with, they thought this whole debate about Aadhaar is all about meta-privacy and techno-privacy. It's nothing to do with privacy culture. And they were talking about our culture of privacy is different from your meta-privacy. So please keep that to yourself. right? So in a similar way, surveillance, your meta-surveillance is completely different from my surveilled culture. I'm constantly monitored and surveilled. This is a very cultural issue to me, and I've got a completely different take on that, and you don't ever talk about my surveillance problems. So so I'm talking about the differences between how people approach the same concept, one from caste, one from digital networks. Then the next one is the Dalit internet. There's been a very constant, especially if you go to conferences, people keep on saying that how the internet has unleashed democratic actions and activism, and how it is now giving voices, again, it's a very cliche term, to Dalits and so on and so forth. I'm not disputing that, and there's more presence of diverse and alternative voices online, no doubt whatsoever. But I invite you to think one step further. What's happening at the moment, I don't know how many of you have watched Dalit Camera, for example. It's a YouTube channel which specializes on issues concerning Dalits. And it's purely a voluntary effort, and I've been part of that initiative for a very long time. And it's one of the most astounding, remarkable presence online, and I don't think such a representation would have been possible if there was no online, there's no internet. So therefore, I give due credit to the digital networks and for this representation, the presence of it. Having said that, there was a conversation amongst us, which is, what's the need to have this space called Dalit Camera? Because the non-Dalit camera space never recognizes Dalit camera space. So it never gets internalized. It's like in Tamil we always call it, there is a genre of media called little magazine, Siru Pathirikai. So the little magazine is basically what it refers to is that whatever mainstream media rejects, go to little magazine, because little magazine content is quite unique and quite niche, and it will never see the light of the day in mainstream space. Therefore, it has to be there in this little magazine space and die there. That's it. And never reach the day of the light in the broader space. And that's what's happening, ironically, to the Dalit internet space. On one level, you have this amazing access to this online infrastructure, and people are actually writing about it, and so on and so forth. At the same time, by the same logic, if you look at it, it's actually a very excluded space. And it's like almost like geographically, if you have a Dalit colony which is ostracized, in online space you have a Dalit internet space which is excluded. Those who want to have access to it, you can access to it. You can access Dalit camera. Of course you can, no one prevents you, but it should remain a separate, exclusive space. Which is very interesting how, with caste networks and digital networks actually interplay in that area. And just so you know that this is not just unique to online, even legacy media also does not have any Dalit representation whatsoever. So it's nothing new, it's just an extension of what's been going on again. And the other thing is that how do we actually understand hate, extreme speeches, insults in caste-affected societies? I've been hearing a lot, several projects in caste-affected societies, like in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, especially in India, that people keep on talking about hate speech and trolls and so on and so forth. And I understand, but I'm also slightly uncomfortable about this, conflating everything into one meta category called hate speech, because if you look at hate speeches in this country, it's nothing new, number one, and if you look at the political side of hate speech, especially in current climate, there's a lot of if you dig deeper, you will see the elements of caste and other things. That's what is driving hate speech. So it's basically okay. So basically, hate speech is nothing but hate speech is a kind of a form, a new form, a digital form, which is wherein the caste continues to manifest. So it would be worth actually looking at how caste is actually interplaying with the digital networks, rather than simply saying, oh, we also have hate speech. That's slightly unhelpful in understanding the real problems in caste-affected societies. Machine learning and AI. I mean, this is another area which is kind of coming up. I'll give you two examples. In Mumbai, there's a website called Team BPH. I don't know how many of you have seen this website. It's India's premier. It's like a TripAdvisor, but for Indian automotive industry. This Team BPH website has got lots of users who write reviews about various trucks and cars and so on. There's a significant pages have been allocated to a gig economy. And one of the themes that you will see recurringly happening, the car owners, not drivers, car owners, who have got a fleet of drivers and the drivers' names are attached to this Uber. And these owners actually continue to write about how difficult it is to employ low-cost drivers and how uncivil they are. And how, it's just a kind of a constant moaning about, I bring capital, these guys have no clue. It's basically, it's sort of going back to how bad the low-cost drivers are. And then it's a very interesting way of looking. It's very interesting if you go and read it. And what I'm saying is that, gig economy and other things are not immune to age-old caste networks. And to solidify my point, Uber recently has announced a scheme by which they've trained 200 manual scavengers to become drivers in outskirts of Delhi, so that they will become Uber drivers. And the reason for Uber to do that, they said, we know that in this gig economy, Dalits and low-cost people will never be part of it unless you make a conscious effort to include them. So that's something to bear in mind. So on one hand, people are constantly, complaining about Dalit people. On the other hand, the corporation is actually making an interesting step towards it. That's the point. So, in conclusion, just 1 minute. Right. Right. In conclusion, all I have to say, if caste is if caste is a communication category and act as a networks, and if it can rework street theater, newspaper, film, mobile, and other digital platform, if it can co-opt and keep on actually influencing this, then the emphasis on the digital networks alone is superfluous for people whose experiences continue to be shaped by caste. Therefore, when the so-called researchers and practitioners, when they begin to pay attention to see how caste continues to rework itself in various media technologies and mediated communication processes, then our understanding of ICT networks and concepts can be quite knowing, especially in caste-affected societies. This, very important, this may also lead to de-westernizing some research agenda with regards to ICTD, media, culture, and communication practices in caste-affected societies again. So finally, caste is inherently communicative and is experienced in everyday social context. As explained in other chapter, it's got various communicative elements. So all I have to is make a plea. If various communication, in caste-affected societies, if various communication categories, let's say caste actually, if you look at the ICTD project, for example, and you have a gender, you have agriculture-related communications, you have microfinance-related communicative elements, all these elements are present, various communicative elements, categories are present in one ICTD project. If you look at all those various different actants, if there is one actant that can possibly connect all other actants, then I would argue caste is perhaps the single most relevant actor that can relate to every other actor in the set of that particular communication categories. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. This was really thought-provoking talk. So you initially mentioned about caste and the caste being part of all the religions, but you touched upon the politics aspect also, the trolling and all. So now bringing back to that we have caste and then we have a religion, and in India we now have a politics which is reflective of a majority religion. And now politics are politicians or politics in itself, which is again a restrictive definition of politics, that the government politics. The government in itself is leveraging the communicative media and the social networks to transfer their messages or create again the various communicative processes in the society. So there is a intersection which is happening between the caste and the religion and the politics, and politicians leveraging these medias. So any thoughts on this complicated intersection which is happening? And similarly, there is caste and religion and current discourses about the broad spectrum of gender, where we are talking about gender inclusion, sexuality, LGBTQI community, those who all are leveraging the communicative spaces. And again, there is a broad intersection of caste, religion, and broad spectrum of gender. So any example on all of these and any insights of how this interplay happens? Politics, caste, religion, and gender. In the communicative spaces, like social media and all, and how, any example of these when we are leveraging the ICT of the technologies to pass on the messages. Like we are, a lot of like for example in gender space, a Me Too movement happened and LGBTQI movements are happening. Similarly, in the political space, a lot of political voices are coming on. We have new political parties representing the voice of Dalits and all. So the intersection, and the religious space also.
I mean, as I said, I'm not seeing this whether it's how much is happening, how much is not happening. I mean, I agree that this, for example, the latest one on smash Brahminical patriarchy on Twitter and the backlash it received. The point I'm more interested in actually looking at, yes, you have lots of space online, and activism is in activism or social action is happening. And obviously, you have a certain kind of a state actors, political parties with a vested interest doing all sorts of things. But I'm more interested in, for example, to go back to that example of smash Brahminical patriarchy, right? What kind of a response is it invoked? On, there's one way of registering the whole event. Yes, there's an online space for people Dalits Dalit feminists to raise their voice, and that's a great thing to do, and therefore, yes, it is happening. But at the same time, how the voice was actually met with structural opposition. And that's not just about social media platform, that's actually reflective of a stronger caste network and privileged network. And especially in that example, some of the most progressive upper caste women journalists actually wrote some really bad stuff. And they disowned this person, right? So to me, that's the kind of a root of the problem. And I like to go back to that, because that's where I think how caste networks actually trumps the social media network. On one level, yes, it is great for a Dalit woman to actually go and then put up, no, it's great, fantastic. And it made it to New York Times. And so therefore, yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. But why did Barkat immediately respond to that incident and say that if I were there, I would not have actually received that placard and post? And then she said, anyway, I'm a progressive woman, I don't care. To me, that, she's a spoiler in the party, right? To me, and then the whole thing fell. To me, that's what I'm actually more into. Do I make sense? Yeah?
Guitar.
Thanks for your talk. I thought that was the most revelatory thing I've heard in a long time in this community. One question I have for you. So I lived and worked in India for a little over 5 years, and I engaged with a lot of projects in which, the goal was to support people of, how I would categorize as being lower class or lower income in their various aspirations. I came across a lot of situations where caste was definitely playing some role in the social dynamics, but to which a lot of it was, simply invisible to me because I didn't have the knee-jerk intuition that I think, Indians in this culture have to caste. And also because I didn't understand all the markers of caste and what it all meant. I know just enough to know that caste is without doubt the worst thing to have happened to this country. But I also know enough to know that, my attempt to address it in my work is likely to end up, being counterproductive in various ways because I'm not conscious of all the issues. What is your recommendation for people who come from outside of this country in terms of how to engage with caste?
Thank you for asking that question. It's a great question, actually. When I started doing my work, the first biased thought I used to have, in the West, no one actually talked about caste, and they should have paid more attention to it. They have, all these people who worked in India and Indian studies. But actually, that's not true, because in some sense, people from caste-affected societies are equally responsible, especially those, the privileged ones. I'm currently writing a paper on caste, how international agencies can actually, critically engage with caste-related issues in caste-affected societies. And one of the things that we're beginning to look at, how civil society organizations in caste-affected societies is extremely reflective of caste structures, right? And so whenever I actually point that out to my fellows or people outside, I'm actually branded as a problematic person, right? But the point I'm trying to say is that it's the literature and the scholarship from caste-affected societies by the privileged community themselves. They need to have a reality check. And I think that is something the international agencies should begin to ask. Like, for example, they have a very strong monitoring, evaluation, tracking process when it comes to race and gender. But such mechanisms and process checks are completely absent when it comes to caste. And that is something that we all have to work together to get that out. I mean, this is the document that we are talking about. This is actually partly, in responding to those needs. So therefore, I think there are two ways. One is Indian civil society, which is why I kind of slightly mentioned, without coming across to be very provocative. If you look at the privacy argument is a borrowed argument from the West and perpetuated and a kind of a narrated by civil societies of certain groups located in metropolis. And it is completely detached from the reality of it. So therefore, we need to actually, the civil societies in this country need to wake up, and international agencies have to put pressure on them. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
Sir, I just wanted to, there is a section of the conversation you did, talk you did, that I'm able to relate to, wherein India broadly has the problem of caste, religion, languages, regional, all kinds of division across the society, which is leading to a number of problems. But there is also a section in your talk that I'm not able to relate to, maybe because of the background I have come from, wherein if you say that is only issue of Dalits, it's an issue of division, which I see. I'll give two examples from my personal life, just to make sure, especially people who are outside the country, also hear the other perspective. So when I was in college, this is in 88 to 92, there were 3 incidents of Dalit men beating up their classmates and colleagues because they fell in love, an upper caste guy fell in love with a girl who belongs to Dalit caste. So there is that other side also. Then I have my someone in my relative close circles who is actually an upper caste guy employed in a government office wherein the boss and the next level are Dalit employers, and he faced the same issue that you faced, wherein don't call me on mobile, don't text me, if you have to ask, come in person and talk to me. And he went to the extent of being harassed multiple times, and he's in a mini depression situation that he occasionally has to visit doctors, etc. So I wonder if the problem is really the caste or the hierarchy in the nature the employment works in India, or whether the issue is about poor versus rich rather than caste related. Just an alternate thought to kind of think through.
I'm not commenting on that.
Go ahead.
So that was really interesting kind of a perspective, especially for someone like me who thinks of myself to be a network theorist. So if I want to just abstract this whole notion of caste from a network theorist trying to model networks, social networks, there are probably two options, right? One is to say that the caste equation kind of plays into the transaction that we are having or the communication we are having, or to say that the caste equation is different, a separate link, and the communication equation is a separate link, and they both interplay, right? Am I making sense? So I'm just trying to understand your perspective on, from your ground practical experience, which of these would probably be much more realistic to assume?
Caste or communication?
No, obviously there is both the caste equation and a communication equation, right?
I think what I've been saying is that caste is actually...
caste is also, and then on top of it there's an equation for a transaction. Like for example, I am a seller and you're a buyer, and there is an equation beyond. So there are two networks at play. One is the caste communication network, and the other is the business or whatever you're trying to model network.
I got your point. I got your point. See, the thing is, one of the questions people ask me that, do I mean to say that caste is like ever present in the face and it is actually working out with every transaction? No. But it's like sustainable development. It's defined by its absence. So it's waiting for it to break out anytime. So, in any particular situation, like, if you're traveling in a bus, that's a form of interaction, right? And it's kind of a commuter networks and crowded bus. And it's fine. It's normal as anything else. But if there arises a particular situation that actually breaks certain kind of norms, then the caste-based communicative practices will kick in. And that's what I'm talking about. So it's always there, just in the air.
So, Murali, just want a fantastic talk. I want to add a question which is kind of similar to Kentaro's, but Kentaro kind of had an outsider question, meaning he's outside the society, and he framed it as, I'm not aware of the caste, I don't see caste, and how, so he could say, how do you deal with it? But what if, how are people who are born in this society who have seen caste or might not have picked up all the nuances that exist, but are trying perhaps to be conscious of caste, but their habitus might be perhaps preventing them from fully understanding it. Take an example of Arundhati Roy's writing the preface to Ambedkar's book, and there's a lot of conflict, a lot of pushback from which is a reasonable pushback. But the question is, I'm not interested in that particular debate that happened. I'm more interested in knowing from as researchers who want to be sensitive of the communicative network that you brought out. We occupy certain nodes, in the network. And how does one intervene and be a part of the discourse without actually messing it up, right? Yeah. And like what Arundhati seemed to have done. So I'm just curious to see what's your kind of concrete advice, other than just having thick skin to brace the pushback and then fail and then be mindful and keep going. So is that the way to do it, or is there any other thing that you've seen?
That's a great question. Thanks, Rajesh. I mean, I always actually tell people that how many people who the research scholar field, especially those who work in India, and they talk about development inclusion. I ask them, have you read Ambedkar? And it's a sad story that more than 90% of scholars haven't read him at all, which is not their fault. Again, it's just because that it's absent in curriculum, right? I think all I'm trying to say there's a structural issue that one has to be voluntarily expose themselves to the anti-caste intellectual thinking tradition, and that's slightly missing, I would say. But I think personally, who's someone who's very familiar with this thinking, I have a different learning process, I would say. And when it comes to gender studies, I still find it, I'm still learning. I do not know everything at all. And my personal take is that just be open about it, because I believe in equality. I believe in respecting fellow human is an important thing. As long as that actually acts as a bottom line, all my thinking is, okay, I don't know much about feminist, I don't know everything about feminist thinking, gender studies, so keeping an open mind. I mean, it is happening already. And I'm sure that most, I've seen, very interestingly, I've seen most the so-called upper caste scholars from India are more open to gender studies, more to, gender-related thinking, than caste-related, anti-caste tradition. So I think it's just kind of being aware of it, I think. There's nothing more I could say.
Thank you. I think the last question.
First off, thank you. The talk itself and your topic has some very strong post-colonial connotations, which I do very much appreciate. Sometimes kind of wish we spoke about that more in our ICTD research. But what you were speaking of, I was kind of homing in on a tension that does bother me a lot when I'm thinking about ICT research and implementing projects in cultural contexts that aren't the ones that we come from as researchers or scholars or practitioners. And that is, when you're speaking of this discourse, to what extent do we have as a responsibility as scholars, practitioners, and researchers to affect that discourse in some way? So this is kind of taking off of what Dr. Tayama was talking about, but I'm getting a little bit more, trying to hack down a bit more in the details of this, because, we think about, okay, we don't want to enforce our own cultural norms and values while we are developing these projects and while we are implementing our studies and whatnot. But at the same time, if we're not really taking seriously that there are ethical principles that we may hold true beyond simply cultural borders, if we ignore these things, then we can risk perpetuating as societies rise up, as nations build, creating bigger, more powerful societies that may treat their citizens and their subpopulations in ways that we don't appreciate. So let's say, for instance, we're working with a community that starts off fairly. So, I'm sorry, which part? Okay. So let's take for an example, right? We're working with a community that is disempowered, maybe in a state similar to this. And over the years, maybe centuries, this community rises up and becomes a nation that can play a political or an economic force in the broad global scale of whatever political milieu we consider the world to be. And if the people and the practitioners and the actors that helped build that nation were not themselves having some kind of idea of what a nation could be in terms of how it treats its subpopulations, its communities that are going to be downtrodden once this current group becomes something with power, is there something that we should be looking at those actors and saying, well, maybe we built this wrong. Maybe we did not contribute all the things that we should have contributed. Now, I don't want to take this all the way to the full extent of this and say, oh, we should just make a bunch of little Western nations. That's not the point. But rather that, what do you think about that tension that exists between what we could consider to be right, but also understanding that the world that we work with does not see these principles or interpret these principles the same way that we do, or their value towards their society or their practices?
Must confess, I didn't fully get the question. Can someone else help me?
Maybe you should take it offline. Okay. We're running out of time.
No, I'm not sure if I fully understood the question.
Maybe we should take it offline because we're running out of time. I want to take the time to thank Murali again for such an illuminating talk, and we rarely get to see it. Thank you. So we're going to take, instead of having a 30-minute break, we're going to take a 15-minute break and have some chai and coffee and reflect on what he said and come back. Thank you.